They didn't call it exile at first. They called it administrative distancing, which in Vulpine political language meant the same thing it always did. You were still alive, but you were no longer convenient. The announcement was delivered in a chamber designed to intimidate. Everything about it screamed strength: towering stone walls, banners stitched with conquest marks, guards standing so still they might as well have been decorative statues. Strength, to the Vulpine Empire, was loud, rigid, and completely unyielding. Which was exactly why the princess standing in the center of the chamber made everyone uncomfortable. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. That alone should have been enough to prove competence. But the council didn't measure strength by composure. They measured it by how little you cared. Princess Aelira of House Vakes, the High Arbiter announced, his voice echoing far longer than necessary. You have been evaluated and found insufficient. A murmur rippled through the chamber. The word insufficient was rarely used in public. It was vague on purpose. Vulpines liked their condemnations flexible. Aelira lifted her gaze. She made eye contact with the Arbiter. That was her first mistake. You hesitate, another counselor added, tail flicking in visible irritation. You consider outcomes. You ask questions. Yes, Aelira said calmly, before making decisions that affect others. Several council members shifted. One of them clicked their claws together, a gesture that translated loosely to unnecessary detail. And worst of all, the Arbiter continued, you bond. The chamber went quiet. Bonding was not illegal. It was simply inefficient. Attachments slowed response times. Familiarity blurred hierarchy. Caring created complications. You remember subordinates' names, a general said flatly. You listen when they speak beyond allotted time. You linger. Aelira almost smiled at that one. Almost. She responds too easily, another voice added. Adjusts her tone. Softens when challenged.
Softened.
As if leadership were a muscle, and she'd failed to keep it tense at all times. The Arbiter leaned forward. Strength requires distance. Control. The ability to apply pressure without involvement. Aelira nodded once. Pressure applied without understanding brake systems. The council did not like being told they were bad at systems. You are labeled weak, the Arbiter said, and therefore exiled. The word landed heavier than any shout could have. Exile meant removal from influence, from structure, from the carefully controlled environment where strength was recognized. It meant being sent somewhere inconveniently, undefined. Effective immediately, the Arbiter added. You will be reassigned beyond Imperial territory. Minimal resources. No retinue. Aelira bowed, as protocol demanded. Her posture was straight. Controlled. Strong, by any reasonable metric. Reasonable metrics were not in use that day. What no one noticed, because no one was watching the periphery, was the human leaning against the side wall, holding a data slate and a cup of something steaming and bitter-smelling. He had arrived late. Humans did that. He hadn't bothered interrupting the proceedings because, frankly, they looked like they were enjoying themselves. When the word exiled echoed for the second time, the human lifted his head. Quick question, he said casually. The chamber froze. Dozens of eyes snapped toward him. Guard stiffened. One of the counselors hissed quietly, the Vulpine equivalent of why is it still talking? The Arbiter frowned. Identify yourself. Daniel Mercer, the human said, taking a sip of his drink. Diplomatic logistics. Assigned liaison. I think. You are not recognized as a voting authority, the Arbiter said sharply. Didn't say I was, Daniel replied. Just confused. Confusion was not respected in Vulpine politics. You exiled her, Daniel continued, gesturing vaguely toward Aelira. For being what, exactly? The Arbiter's ears flattened slightly. For weakness. Daniel tilted his head.
Right.
And by weakness you mean? She forms attachments, a counselor snapped. She hesitates. She connects, another added, as if that word tasted unpleasant. Daniel nodded slowly.
Okay.
Just making sure we're using the same dictionary. Aelira glanced at him then, surprised despite herself. Humans were usually careful in formal chambers. This one looked like he'd wandered into the wrong meeting and decided to stay. So, Daniel said, scrolling his slate, you removed a leader who retains loyalty, maintains morale, and considers consequences because she's bad at being cold. The Arbiter bristled. Emotional restraint is strength. Sure, Daniel said easily. In moderation. Silence stretched. The Vulpines did not like moderation. It sounded indecisive. You will accompany her, the Arbiter said abruptly, eyes narrowing. As compliance oversight. Daniel blinked. Me? You have shown interest, the Arbiter said. You will supervise her exile. Ensure she does not leverage influence improperly. The phrase leverage influence carried a warning tone. Vulpines feared leverage almost as much as rebellion. Daniel looked from the council to Aelira. Then he shrugged. All right. Aelira's ears twitched. You don't have to. It's fine, Daniel said quietly. I was due for a change of scenery. The Arbiter clearly regretted the decision already, but protocol had momentum now. Very well, he said. Proximity authorized. Distance maintained. Daniel smiled faintly. Humans aren't great at distance. That earned him a glare sharp enough to cut glass. The transport left within the hour. Aelira stood at the viewport as Imperial space receded, her expression unreadable. She had expected anger, grief, something dramatic. Instead, she felt lighter. Unanchored, yes, but no longer suffocating under expectations she'd never agreed with. Daniel leaned against the opposite wall, finally setting his cup aside. So, he said, breaking the silence, apparently you're dangerous. She glanced at him. That is not the word they used. They never do, he replied. They use cleaner ones. A pause settled between them. Not awkward. Observational. They believe connection weakens authority, Aelira said finally. Daniel nodded. Yeah. Some humans believe that too. She studied him. And you? I think, he said after a moment, that connection just changes how power moves. Her tail flicked once, slow and thoughtful. They fear what they cannot control, she said. Usually, Daniel agreed, because it lasts longer than force. She looked at him fully then. Held his gaze. Not dominance. Not challenge. Recognition. The kind that lingered just long enough to be noticed. Behind them, unseen by either of them, a Vulpine observer drone recorded everything. The posture. The proximity. The way the princess seemed responsive. Later, the report would summarize it clinically. Subject displays increased engagement under sustained human presence. The Empire would not understand yet what that meant. But they would. The exile facility was not designed for comfort. It was designed for forgetting. A rotating station at the edge of mapped space, far enough from trade lanes to be irrelevant, close enough to be monitored. The kind of place empires sent problems they didn't want to solve but weren't ready to eliminate. Aelira noticed everything within minutes. The lighting was uneven. The air recyclers lagged by half a cycle. The staff avoided eye contact, not out of disrespect, but habit. People who worked in forgotten places learned not to look too closely at each other. Daniel noticed one thing. No one here trusts anyone, he said, setting his bag down and glancing around. That's going to be a problem. Aelira folded her arms. Trust is not required for order. No, Daniel replied, but it's required for things to work longer than a week. She studied him. Humans had a way of stating opinions as if they were observations, which made them irritatingly difficult to argue with. They began with nothing dramatic. No declarations. No speeches. Daniel insisted on walking the station first, slowly, stopping to talk to people who looked surprised to be addressed. Aelira noticed the pattern immediately. He asked names. Not ranks. Not functions. Names. He remembered them. The technician who oversaw power flow hesitated when Daniel asked how things were going. No one usually asked that. Daniel waited. Didn't rush him. Didn't fill the silence. Eventually, the technician spoke. Aelira watched it happen the way one watches a mechanical process. Input, pause, output. The pause was the key. Vulpines despised pauses. They felt like loss of control. "You do that on purpose," she said later. Daniel shrugged. "People say more if they don't feel chased. They might say too much." "Only if you punish honesty," he replied. That answer stayed with her longer than she expected. Within days, the station felt different. Not efficient, not orderly in the Vulpine sense, but responsive. Problems surfaced earlier. Minor conflicts resolved before escalating. People lingered in conversations instead of scattering. Observers from the Empire logged the changes with unease. Subject Aelira displays increased interaction frequency. Human associate encourages extended engagement. Potential dependency pattern forming. Aelira read the reports with a flick of her tail. "They think I am being conditioned." Daniel laughed quietly. "They should see actual conditioning." He didn't train her the way Vulpines trained leaders. There were no dominance drills, no endurance contests, no public challenges. Instead, he asked questions that felt uncomfortably practical. Who do you rely on when something breaks? Who argues with you? Who tells you when you're wrong? She answered honestly. He never reacted the way she expected. "That's good," he'd say. Or, "That explains a lot." At one point, she snapped at him. "You are guiding me," she said sharply. "You adjust my responses." He raised his hand slightly. "I'm not adjusting you. I'm giving you leverage." That word again. Leverage. In Vulpine language, leverage implied force applied at a critical point. Pressure. Pain sometimes. In Daniel's mouth, it sounded different. Observers noticed other things too. The distance between them when they spoke. The way he angled his body toward her instead of looming. The fact that she listened without interrupting. That she responded better to guidance than command. That phrase appeared in 3 separate reports. Responds better to guidance. The Empire flagged it as concerning. They flagged the pauses as well. Humans paused before answering. Aelira began doing the same. Not out of uncertainty, but intent. Silence became a tool. It unsettled Vulpines far more than shouting ever had. During a minor dispute over supply allocation, Aelira said nothing for nearly 10 seconds. The argument collapsed under its own weight. Daniel smiled afterward. "See? Pressure isn't always applied by pushing." She glanced at him. "Then how is it applied?" "By knowing when not to move," he said. That night, as they stood overlooking the dim curve of the station, the space between them felt deliberate. Not empty. Charged, but quiet. "You do not retreat when situations become complex," she said. Daniel chuckled. "Humans are bad at clean exits." "That is not what I meant." He looked at her then really looked. No analysis. No strategy. Just attention. "Yeah," he said softly. "I know." That look was noted. The drone captured the angle of their bodies, the stillness, the lack of urgency. Extended proximity observed. No overt dominance displays. Potential emotional reinforcement loop. The Empire did not understand loops unless they were closed. Weeks passed. The station thrived in ways it wasn't supposed to. Productivity increased. Conflict decreased. Loyalty became visible, not enforced. Aelira realized something unsettling. She wasn't becoming softer. She was becoming harder to destabilize. When a senior administrator attempted to undermine her authority by citing imperial doctrine, she listened fully, nodded, and reassigned him to a role better suited to his talents. He left confused but not angry. That was Daniel's search for the word. Elegant. "Efficiency through alignment," she replied. He grinned. "You're a fast learner." "I was always capable," she said calmly. "I know," he replied. "They just tested the wrong thing." That sentence lingered between them longer than necessary. When the Empire finally intervened, it was subtle. A delegation arrived under the pretense of inspection. They observed. They listened. They recorded. And they were deeply unsettled. There was no rebellion to suppress. No weapons to confiscate. No violation to punish. Just a leader who no longer needed force. The arbiter's message arrived encoded and cold. "Prepare for reassessment." Daniel read it over her shoulder. "That sounds ominous." "They will test me," Aelira said. Publicly. Good, he replied. You're ready. She looked at him. You are certain? I'm human, he said. Certainty is optional. Commitment isn't. The transport back to Imperial space was quiet. Not tense. Focused. As the stars stretched into lines, Aelira spoke without turning. If I fail, she said, they will say I grew weak again. Daniel leaned back. They can say whatever they want. She met his eyes. Held them. Just long enough. And if I succeed? He smiled, slow and knowing. Then they'll have to redefine strength. Behind them, the drone recorded the silence. This time, the report hesitated before categorizing it. Imperial space hadn't changed. It still gleamed with order, symmetry, and the kind of rigid beauty that only existed when nothing unexpected was allowed to survive for long. The difference was that Aelira noticed how carefully curated it was now. Strength here wasn't natural. It was maintained. Constantly. The delegation received her with controlled politeness. No insults. No praise. Just eyes measuring distance, posture, timing. They were already looking for cracks. Daniel stayed half a step behind her, exactly where protocol demanded and human instincts ignored. He said nothing. That alone unsettled them. The council chamber felt smaller than before. Or perhaps she had grown into the space. She stood without armor, without guards, without raised voice. The lack of spectacle irritated them. You return changed, the arbiter said, ears angled forward. Your exile appears ineffective. That depends on the purpose, Aelira replied. A ripple moved through the chamber. She hadn't waited for permission to speak. We observed no increase in aggression, a general added. No consolidation of force. No demonstrations of dominance. Aelira nodded. Correct. And yet, the arbiter said slowly, your influence has expanded. There it was. The part they didn't like. Aelira gestured behind her. Not to Daniel directly, but to the space he occupied. I learned from humans. A few counselors stiffened. One hissed under their breath. Humans lack discipline, the arbiter said. They lack hierarchy. Daniel shifted his weight slightly. Still silent. They lack fear, Aelira said. Which changes behavior. The council exchanged looks. Fear was foundational. Remove it, and everything else wobbled. You stand accused of destabilizing imperial order, the arbiter said. Through connection. The word landed like a contamination warning. Aelira tilted her head. Order that cannot tolerate connection is fragile. Murmurs spread. The guard's grips tightened. You were labeled weak, the arbiter reminded her. For bonding too easily. For responding to others instead of commanding them. Yes, Aelira agreed. I respond. The arbiter's tail lashed. Strength requires control. And control, Aelira replied evenly, requires cooperation if it is to last. A counselor leaned forward. You speak as if authority must be earned. Daniel smiled faintly. That one line did more damage than any speech. The arbiter raised a claw. Enough philosophy. You will demonstrate your strength. Now. Aelira did not hesitate. Very well. They expected combat. A trial. A symbolic challenge. That was how these things were done. Instead, she asked for a report. Confusion flickered across several faces. A real one, she added. Current. Unfiltered. The arbiter frowned. From whom? Anyone, Aelira said. Choose. A junior administrator was dragged forward, clearly unprepared. He stammered through a supply disruption explanation, hands shaking, eyes darting between counselors. Normally, this was where intimidation happened. Aelira waited. She let him speak until he stopped on his own. Then she asked a single question. What do you need to fix it? The administrator blinked. No one had ever asked him that in this chamber. He answered. Aelira turned to the council. Permission granted? They hesitated. The pause stretched. It was uncomfortable. It was powerful. Finally, the arbiter nodded stiffly. Within minutes, the disruption had a solution. Not perfect, not dramatic, but effective. The council watched, unsettled. That was not strength, a general protested. That was delegation. Yes, Alyra said, which multiplies capacity. Daniel cleared his throat softly. Just once. Humans call it scalability. Several counselors flinched at the unfamiliar term. You rely too much on others, the arbiter snapped. Alyra met his gaze without aggression. I rely correctly. A hush fell. Observers noticed how she held eye contact without challenging. How she didn't push, yet didn't yield. The balance was precise. Reports would later phrase it awkwardly. Subject maintains pressure, without escalation. The council tried again. A political rival accused her of undermining loyalty by encouraging emotional ties. Another warned that her methods would weaken discipline. A third implied impropriety with her human associate without quite daring to say it aloud. Alyra listened to all of it. Fully. Calmly. When they finished, she spoke. You fear attachment because you believe it creates vulnerability, she said. But vulnerability only exists when trust is one-sided. She gestured to the council. You demand loyalty. You do not return it. Silence. Daniel's presence became very noticeable, not because he moved, but because he didn't. He let her lead. That, too, was noted. She does not dominate, one observer whispered. She maintains. That phrase traveled quickly. The arbiter stood. You are walking a dangerous line. Yes, Alyra said. So do humans. Constantly. Daniel finally spoke. We just learned how to balance. The chamber erupted into overlapping voices. Accusations. Warnings. Fear dressed up as authority. Alyra waited them out. When they quieted, she delivered the final blow without raising her voice. You exiled me because I connected, she said. Because I paused. Because I listened. Those were never weaknesses. They were warnings. I see what you cannot. The arbiter stared at her. And what is that? That your empire is strong only because no one has tested its patience, she replied. I have. No weapons were drawn. No threats issued. And yet, the balance of the room had shifted. The council recessed abruptly, citing the need for deliberation. Vulpine, for we need time. As the chamber emptied, Alyra exhaled slowly. The tension drained, but the focus remained. Daniel stepped closer. Not touching, not crowding. Just present. You did well, he said. I did what was necessary, she replied. He smiled. That too. She glanced at him, then away. They will resist. Of course, Daniel said. Humans do too. A beat. They will adapt, he added. Or they'll be replaced. She looked at him sharply. You speak as if that is inevitable. He met her gaze, unflinching. It usually is. The drone hovered nearby, recording posture, distance, silence. It struggled to classify what it was seeing. No dominance. No submission. Just alignment. For the first time since the exile began, the Empire did not know what to label her. And that made her stronger than they were ready to admit. The council didn't sleep after that. Vulpines were proud of many things: discipline, endurance, restraint. But rest was not among them when control felt threatened. They called emergency sessions. They summoned advisors. They checked loyalty metrics like a dying patient checking their pulse every minute. Alyra didn't chase them. That was the first thing that broke their rhythm. She stayed in the guest quarters assigned to her, calm enough to be insulting, and spent her time doing something that looked like nothing: listening. Staff whispered. Guards pretended not to watch. Administrators came to verify procedures and somehow left having confessed problems they hadn't intended to mention. Daniel watched it all with the quiet amusement of someone seeing a familiar pattern in an unfamiliar culture. They're spiraling, he said softly one evening. Alyra's ears angled toward him. They are accelerating pressure. On themselves, he corrected. Classic. She looked at him. You predicted this. I've met committees, he said. Different species, same disease. The final test came disguised as tradition. The arbiter sent a formal summons with ceremonial language, the kind that was supposed to make a leader feel small before they even arrived. A proving of strength will occur. Your methods will be evaluated under crisis conditions. Aelira read it once. Then again. Then she handed it to Daniel. They intend to trap me, she said. Daniel scanned it. They intend to make you solve their mess while they judge you for touching it. That is accurate, Aelira replied. He gave her a sideways look. You're smiling. I am not, she said, then realized her mouth had shifted slightly. I am prepared. The council chamber was full when she arrived. More guards than necessary. More officials than protocol required. That many witnesses meant they expected a collapse they could broadcast. The arbiter stood tall, voice sharp with ceremony. Princess Aelira, he announced, you will demonstrate strength as our ancestors defined it, stability under pressure. Aelira inclined her head. Present the crisis. A counselor stepped forward with a report, eyes a little too eager. Trade lanes have failed. 2 outer stations are refusing shipments. Labor sectors are threatening shutdown. Production has slowed by 14%. Aelira didn't react like they wanted. No outrage. No panic. She asked one question. What have you done so far? The counselor hesitated. We issued directives. And we increased enforcement. And the counselor's tail twitched, annoyed. Compliance dropped. Daniel exhaled quietly through his nose. A small sound, but it carried. A human laugh suppressed. The arbiter's ears flattened slightly. Silence, human. Daniel held both hands up.
Sorry.
It's just predictable. Aelira kept her gaze on the council. You applied pressure and expected loyalty, she said. But loyalty is not extracted. It is generated. A murmur rose. Several counselors shifted, already defensive. Enough, the arbiter snapped. Solve it.
Now.
Under observation. Aelira nodded once. Then we begin properly. She requested the presence of 3 people the council rarely acknowledged, a shipping coordinator, a shift supervisor, and a maintenance chief. Not high-ranking. Not impressive.
Real.
The chamber balked at first. The arbiter tried to refuse. Aelira didn't argue. She simply waited. The silence pressed harder than a command ever could. Eventually, the arbiter gave a stiff nod. Summon them. When they arrived, they looked terrified. Not because the crisis was severe, but because they were standing in a room designed to crush the spirit. Aelira softened her voice, not weakness, precision. You are not on trial, she said. You are needed. The shipping coordinator blinked, as if he hadn't heard correctly. Needed? Yes, Aelira replied. Tell me what is actually happening. He glanced nervously at the council. His mouth opened, closed. Daniel stepped forward half a pace and stopped, careful not to invade the moment. You won't be punished for telling the truth, he said calmly. If anyone tries, they answer to her. The coordinator looked at Aelira. She nodded once. And the truth poured out. Shipments weren't failing because the lanes were unsafe. They were failing because schedules were impossible. Labor wasn't refusing because they were rebellious. They were refusing because leadership kept changing requirements without warning. Production wasn't slowing because of laziness. It was slowing because maintenance parts were being delayed to fund ceremonial projects. The council's faces tightened with each sentence. They weren't angry at the facts. They were angry that the facts were audible. Aelira listened without interrupting, tail still, gaze steady. When the coordinator finished, she didn't immediately speak. She let the silence settle. It made everyone nervous. Then she asked the simplest question in the room. What would fix it? The shift supervisor answered first, voice shaky but clear. Stop changing targets mid-cycle. The maintenance chief added, prioritize parts over ceremony for 1 quarter. The coordinator swallowed. And give us a single point of contact. 1 person. Not 10 counselors arguing. Aelira nodded. Agreed. The arbiter bristled. You cannot restructure imperial priorities based on. Aelira turned to him. Not aggressive. Not submissive. The kind of calm that made shouting look childish. You asked for stability under pressure, she said. This is stability. It is not loud. Several counselors hissed. Aelira continued anyway, because now the room was hers without her needing to claim it. She assigned roles on the spot. Not promotions, responsibilities. One coordinator empowered to lock schedules. One maintenance budget protected from ceremonial raids. One channel for labor grievances that did not run through council ego. Each decision was backed by one thing the Empire had never treated as currency.
Trust.
You, she told the shift supervisor, will report to me directly for 30 cycles. If something breaks, you say it immediately. The supervisor stared at her. Directly? Yes, Alira said. I will listen. The council hated that word. Listen. It implied equals. And if the council disagrees? The maintenance chief asked cautiously. Alira glanced toward them. The smallest hint of humor appeared in her eyes. Then they may schedule an appointment, she said. A ripple of shock hit the chamber. Then, from the back, someone made an accidental choking sound that might have been laughter. The arbiter's tail snapped. This is insolence. It is management, Alira replied. Humans excel at it. Daniel tilted his head. We really do. It's almost embarrassing. That earned him a glare so sharp it could have sliced a whole plate, but it was too late. The room had felt a different kind of power now. Practical power. The kind that made life work. The test wasn't over, though. The council had one last move. A rival counselor stepped forward, voice silky with implication. Your closeness to the human has influenced your conduct. Your judgment may be compromised. There it was. The accusation carefully shaped so it sounded scandalous, without saying anything explicit. Alira didn't flinch. Daniel didn't either. Alira responded with a single breath of amusement. Controlled, quiet. You think proximity weakens me, she said. Because you believe closeness makes you vulnerable. She held the counselor's gaze. That is your flaw, not mine. The counselor's ears twitched. And what is his influence then? Alira didn't look at Daniel when she answered. That made it sharper. He does not retreat when things become complicated, she said. He stays. That is not compromise. That is consistency. Double meaning hung in the air, clean but unmistakable. The chamber stiffened. Some looked offended. Others looked curious. A few looked like they suddenly understood why her methods were working. Daniel's mouth curved into a slow smile. He didn't speak. He let the implication stand without pushing it. Alira continued, voice even. Connection is not weakness. It is leverage. The arbiter's claws flexed. You speak that word as if it is noble. It is, Alira replied. When used responsibly. She gestured subtly to the three workers. They are not afraid to speak now. That is strength. The council fell silent because they could feel it. The shift in loyalty wasn't forced. It was offered. And once loyalty was offered, force looked crude. The crisis resolved quickly after that, not because Alira performed a miracle, but because she removed the friction the Empire insisted on calling tradition. Schedules stabilized. Maintenance flowed. Labor returned to work not because they were threatened, but because they were respected. The council gathered again, privately this time, and faced the truth they despised. She had passed the test. Worse. She had changed what the test meant. When the arbiter finally addressed her, his voice had lost some of its certainty. You have demonstrated effectiveness, he said, like it hurt. Alira inclined her head. Thank you. And yet, he added, grasping for control, your methods are dangerous. Alira's eyes narrowed slightly. To whom? Silence. Daniel's voice cut through it, calm as gravity. To people who only know how to lead with fear. The arbiter's ears flattened. Alira turned, just slightly, toward Daniel, the smallest acknowledgement.
Not ownership.
Not dependence. Alignment. The council did what councils always did when cornered by a reality they couldn't deny. They reframed. They declared that Alira's strength had matured. That exile had refined her. That her approach was a new imperial strategy. They attempted to take credit. Alira let them. That was the part that truly proved her strength. She didn't need the credit. She needed the outcome. Later, after the chamber emptied and the corridors quieted, Aelira stood at a viewport again. Imperial stars. Imperial silence. Daniel approached, stopping at a respectful distance. "You won," he said. "I did not fight," she replied. He nodded. "That's why you won." A pause settled, the kind they had learned to trust. In that pause lived everything unspoken: relief, satisfaction, tension that didn't require action. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "So, what happens now? They going to chain you to a throne again?" Aelira's tail flicked once, amused. "They will try." "And you?" he asked. She looked at him fully, held his gaze. "I will lead," she said. Differently. He smiled. "Good." Another pause. Longer this time. Charged but still clean. The kind of moment that made observers invent stories because they couldn't stand ambiguity. Aelira spoke first. "You will return to your delegation," she said, voice steady. Daniel's smile faded just slightly. "Yeah." "You do not belong to this empire," she continued. "Probably not," he said softly. She took a slow breath. "But you belong to what you changed." That landed between them with the weight of a promise, without being one. Daniel's eyes softened. "Careful, princess." That almost sounded like an invitation. Aelira's mouth curved, small, controlled, dangerous in its calm. "Humans respond well to guidance," she said. Daniel blinked once, then let out a quiet laugh. "That is a wildly irresponsible thing to say in a royal corridor." "It is a realistic observation," she replied, perfectly composed. He stepped back half a pace, as if giving the moment room to breathe. "So, what do you want, Aelira?" She didn't answer immediately. She let the silence do what it always did, strip away performance. Then she said, "Stay." One word. No explanation. No demand. Not even a title. Daniel's chest rose as he inhaled. He looked like he wanted to make a joke, but didn't. The humor was still there, just tempered by something real. "Complicated," he murmured. Aelira's eyes narrowed slightly, not in threat, but in certainty. "Humans don't retreat when things get complicated," she said. He held her gaze, then nodded once, slow. "Yeah," he admitted. "We really don't." Somewhere in the distance, a drone hovered, watching like always, trying to classify what it saw. It would fail. Because what it witnessed wasn't weakness. Wasn't dominance. Wasn't scandal. It was the kind of strength empires feared most. The kind that lasts.